Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Wendy Rockwell. I am I am president of the International Union for Land Value Taxation and Free Trade. I hear an echo.
It's okay now.
Okay. Um, so I welcome everyone, and I would like to also invite everyone to go to our webpage and to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. Some of you may have gotten this announcement of this event through our website, others through other organizations. But I would like to invite you to do that if you haven't already signed up for our newsletter. This talk is being sponsored by the Council of Georgia's Organizations, Earth Rights Institute, Public Revenue Education Council, the Better Cities Committee, School of Cooperative Individualism, Confed, and Lay Society. We are presenting a series of which this is the second one, and we will be having two more. And this presentation is given by Alanna Hartzok. She is the most valiant administrator of the IU, for which I am very grateful. Her book, The Earth Belongs to Everyone, a collection of 30 of her articles and essays, received the Radical Middle Book Award. She was raised in a conservative Republican family, but ran as a Democrat for Congress for this in her district in 2014, and the Green Party candidate in 2001. Her E.F. Schumacher lecture is titled Democracy, Earth Rights, and the Next Economy. She was instrumental in the passage of nearly a unanimous passage of enabling legislation for land value taxation for the 1,000 small towns incorporated as boroughs in Pennsylvania. Her presentation for this EU forum is titled Viewing Class and Race Through a Land Lens. Of course, us Georgians, we see everything through a land lens. And so I would like to ask everyone to turn off your mics so so there's no background noises. And you can post your questions in the chat, and there will also be time at the end for any questions that we may have or comments. So I would like to present Alanna Hartzok.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. Let me just move through the slides. If I can press the right button here. Not moving, is it?
There we go.
So in order to really grasp what this topic is about, we have to look at a deep history of the land problem in the United States. And to look at that deep history, we have to go to England and the history of England, because there's one continuous episode around the land issues. So we're going to look at medieval manners, feudalism and grants of land, Middle Age feudalism based on the exchange of land called a fief for military service. King William the Conqueror used the concept of feudalism to reward his Norman supporters for their help in the conquest of England. Of course, he was in the Normandy, the France area. The land belonging to the English was taken and given to Norman knights and nobles. These estates were known as manors. Life lived under the medieval feudal system, or feudalism demanded that everyone owed allegiance to the king and their immediate superior. Everyone was expected to pay for the land by providing the following services of work days, completing any chores required, and providing trained soldiers to fight for the king, and clothes and weapons for the soldiers. William Usually known as William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England, reigned from 1066 until 1087. His hold was secure on Normandy by 1060, following a long struggle to establish his throne and launch the Norman conquest of England 6 years later. The rest of his life was marked by struggles to consolidate his hold over England and his continental lands. The Harrying of the North was a number of campaigns waged by William the Conqueror in the winter of 1069 to 70 to subjugate northern England. Contemporary chronicles vividly record the savage of the campaign, the huge scale of the destruction, the widespread famine caused by looting, burning, and slaughtering. Records from the Domesday Book showed that 75% of the population died or never returned. That Domesday Book is something he created. It's a book of land tenure, land value throughout England. It's still referred to often today, but this is just to show that even before this feudal period that we know of in England, the enclosures that we'll cover, there was this terrible conquest. And if you read those links to William the Conqueror, it's just nothing but wars over land and territory, year after year after year. Who's controlling what? Who's pushing who away? So that's the sordid background, really, of the land problem in the United States. Now, let's look at this carefully. This is a map of a typical feudal manor house or manor land. You're going to see common pastures, meadows, these long rectangular strips are different kinds of planting agricultural land. There's fallow land, the autumn planting, the spring planting, and so on. They obviously did a kind of crop rotations. You're going to see ponds and creeks. You'll see the manor house there on the bottom middle. You'll see a church and orchards, everything that a territory needs to be self-sufficient. The average acreage of these manors were 1,000 to 1,200 acres. Look now towards the bottom to the dark green. You will see these are little houses, little buildings. This was the manor's village area where the peasants lived in their small houses, and they also had like maybe bakeries or clothing shops, things like local crafts and handcrafts were made by the peasants. So this was a stability period. The peasants had rights to the common pasture for their animals, meadows. These individual strips were individually owned and used by the peasants for their own needs. The lord's land was called his demesne or domain, which he required to support himself and his retinue. The rest of the land of the manors were allotted to the peasants who were his tenants. A peasant, instead of having his land in one compact mass, had it split up into a large number of small strips, about a half acre each, scattered over the manor and separated not by fences or hedges, but by banks of unplowed turf. Besides his holding of farmland, each peasant had certain rights over the non-arable land of the manors, the common land. He could cut a limited amount of hay from the meadow. He could turn so many farm animals, including cattle, geese, and swine, on the waste. He also enjoyed the privilege of taking so much wood from the forest for fuel and building purposes. A peasant's holding, which also included a house in the village, thus formed a self-sufficient unit. But we saw then, after this kind of balance period between the peasants and the lords on up, the Enclosure Acts, which that's an old spelling of the word, now usually spelled with the E, enclosure, cover enclosure of the open fields and the common land in England and Wales. That map that showed those fields and common land, they were enclosed, creating legal property rights to land previously held in common. Between 1604 and 1914, over 5,200 individual enclosure acts were passed, affecting 6.8 million acres. And there it is in the hectares. A typical round of enclosure began when several or even a single prominent landholder, manor lord, initiated it by petition to Parliament. The commissioners were invariably of the same class and outlook as the major landowners who had petitioned in the first place. So it was not surprising that the great landholders awarded themselves the best land and the most of it, thereby making England a classic land of great, well-kept estates with a small marginal peasantry and a large class of rural wage laborers. Okay, so we're seeing that the law was supporting the petitions of the already or dominant landholders who then, now why were they suddenly wanting to enclose and fully privatize their land, which make their peasants off their land, is that sheep became more important than grains as a commodity, more valuable to sell, made the manor lords wealthier. So those little strips of land that the peasants had were enclosed as more and more sheep pasture, and sheep took a lot less labor than the grain. And so the peasants were dispendable and they lost out. Whatever the long, oh, somebody is here in the waiting room, I gotta admit, good, I can see it come in. Post-enclosure, there were three choices. Whatever the long-term effect, the immediate one was to advantage those fortunate enough to become individual owners and disadvantaged peasants. The immediate effect was to devastate the peasant class. When access was systematically denied, ultimately the peasantry was left with three basic alternatives: to work in a serf-like manner as tenant farmers for large landowners. Now, previously, they were only working a couple days a week for the manor lord, much less than we work in ordinary jobs today. But now they had to really work as serfs. They could immigrate to the New World, say as indentured servants, or ultimately to pour into already crowded cities where they pushed down each other's wages by competing for a limited number of jobs. And of course, the fourth was not really a choice. It was where vagrants ended up who couldn't find a job or money, which was in jail. So English folk poem of 1700s is very well known. If you go into this period, you're going to find this poem. They hang the man and flog the woman that steals the goose from off the common, but let the greater villain loose that steals the common from the goose. The law demands that we atone when we take things we do not own, but leave the lords and ladies fine who take things that are yours and mine. Obviously written from a peasant's viewpoint. And here's another version of this: the poor and wretched don't escape if they conspire to the law to break. This must be so, but they endure those who conspire to make the law. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and geese will still a common lack till they go and steal it back. You might say that the purpose of the International Union for Land Value Taxation is to somehow use political operations and systems and education to take our land and our land rent back. We're still at this problem of the enclosure of the commons today. So, and it created a new, welcome to another participant, organization of classes, the peasants with rights and a status, with a share in the fortunes and government of his village, which was, his village was on this manor house, the manor domain, but the manor lord did not have exclusive rights to all that land. He was more like a caretaker in a way, although he has a higher status. Okay, so they had the choice. They were in their village in rags, but they were standing on his feet. Then makes way for the laborer with no corporate rights to defend, no corporate power to invoke, no property to cherish, no ambition to pursue, bent beneath the fear of his masters and the weight of a future without hope. Industrial reserve labor. Cumulatively and within a few generations, the enclosures created a veritable army of industrial reserve labor. The displaced and disfranchised were reduced to working for starvation wages that they supplemented through prostitution, theft, and other stigmatized or illegal means. When the workers swelled the ranks of the poor, the government stepped in once more, this time to assist capitalists who petitioned for tax-funded favors. I mean, if we look at from going agrarian, and then we look at what happened with the enclosures and the sheep being a more profitable commodity, and what did those then lords do with the money from the sheep, their surplus income, you might say, eventually began industrialization. So as even the anti-libertarian historian Christopher Ferrara explains, England's response to the crisis of poverty among the landless proletariat, using a Marxist term, was a system of poor relief supplements to meager wages, adopted de facto throughout England, beginning in 1795, in order to ensure that families did not starve. The result was a vast government subsidized mass of wage-dependent paupers whose capitalist employees, both urban and rural, were freed from the burden of paying even bare subsistence wages. You know, I can't help but think of, for example, well known as Walmart, the big retail store Walmart that pays very low wages, so low, in fact, that many of the workers go on food stamps,
if you like. Sure.
food supplements, and such. So it's similar to then. Now, obviously, the enclosures, after the enclosures and this these kind of welfare system didn't work everywhere, because we still had periods of famine in Ireland, which was maybe not part of England so much, but the Irish were producing food that was after their enclosures. People no longer had their land, and the potato famine. The large landholders in Ireland were shipping their food for market in England, while the Irish peasantry was starving. So that's a story I don't really cover deeply in this series, but you know, many of the Irish also came over as indentured servants. In turn, the palpable misery of this class fueled the rise of a vigorous socialist movement that blamed the Industrial Revolution for the exploitation of the masses. The socialists were aware of the impact of enclosure, but ultimately blamed industrialization. And exploitation by industrialists undoubtedly existed. For one thing, some used government means. But the masses were there to be exploited largely because powerful landowners had used political means to deny to peasants their traditional rural livelihood, meaning their land access. Exploitation was possible because other opportunities had been legally denied. Now, this is an issue that we as people and advocates for the wisdom of Henry George, political economics, and for the land value tax policy, we are up against from the left or from Marxists who are still largely unaware of the land problem as underlying the wealth inequality and political power dynamics issues. So this was, okay, I have to admit somebody else. I'm glad people are still joining and that I can see to let them in as I'm multitasking here. This was, I stumbled across this online. It was a lecture by Nancy Eisenberg at the annual Portier lecture titled White Trash, the 400-year history of class in America. It was given at Spring Hill College just about a year ago, and you can get it on YouTube. He says, I want to point out that we have to understand that in America, we do have a class system. We have always had a class system, but we do not connect it to British understandings of royal society. It starts with the British colonial policy dedicated to resettling the poor. What starts? Our United States class system, and which we've just gone through, tracing this to enclosures. Okay, so first known as waste people and later white trash, propertyless poor whites were considered a distinct breed. For centuries, the worst classes were regarded as extrusions of the least inhabitable land, scrubby, barren, swampy wasteland. All that still relates to home ownership and the rich and poor neighborhoods today. Just think about that for a minute. As I was listening to her talk, I became aware of, in my childhood, the prejudice in my community towards, yes, we use the term, white trash. And these were people who lived in the trailer parks. And I came to fully realize the class prejudice I had as a child. And frankly, I can hardly get it out of my system when I drive past a trailer park. I think, oh, those are poor white people. And I'm just a hairbreadth away from thinking of them as white trash. So I think it's important that we all get to know our own prejudices around class and race. It can be very, very subtle. So stigmatized for their inability to be productive. Why? No land. Their failure to own property. Why? They were removed from property. And their unhealthy children, sick because they didn't have good food or shelter, okay? The composite of English attitudes towards vagrancy, well into the 20th century, sterilization of the breeding poor struck many as a rational solution to an old problem. And we have this eugenics movement continuing on today, unfortunately. Okay, we have waiting room. Names given across the centuries to describe poor whites: waste people, rascals, meaning trash, hillbillies, offscourings, low-downers, rednecks, scallywags, trailer trash. They have been called slothful, rootless, vacant. Throughout time, they have been blamed for many things. They have been blamed for living on bad land as if they had other choices, assumed that they are physically scarred just as their surroundings were. Everybody think a moment now. Is there a new name for this class? Think of Hillary Clinton. What did she call Trump's people? Deplorables, okay? Calling a whole bunch of people deplorables, obviously meaning they were the poor people in the United States, probably did a lot to get people strongly supporting Donald Trump. English ideas of class and poverty never disappeared. Today's trailer trash are seen as yesterday's vagrants on wheels, like the gypsies. While America likes to think that the American Revolution enabled us to break free from aristocracy and class stations, the reality is different. English ideas of class and poverty never disappeared. Thomas Jefferson, had a vision of Yeoman democracy, small farm holder democracy. But what happens to those who never achieve any degree of economic independence? Expendables. They were viewed as expendables that could literally be dumped on the new world. The English hated vagrants, idle folk who wandered the countryside, so they were rounded up. Some were branded, put into workhouses. Children were taken off the streets and sold as indentured servants to cruel masters in America. Jefferson and others hoped the poor would be drawn into our Western territories. The idea that horizontal mobility of moving across the land would substitute for upward mobility laid foundation for America's myth of a classless, exceptional society. But this theory was flawed from the get-go. The West was never an open space, quite like we've been told. Land speculators and powerful men always had the advantage of purchasing the best land. And I don't go into it, but we had George Washington, and so many of our founding fathers were hugely big land speculators and acquired massive amounts of land. Southern elites held that class nation was natural and that Jefferson's all men are created equal was a ridiculous concept. There was a clear class division between slaveholders and poor whites who were subservient to the planter aristocracy. Vagrancy is the condition of homelessness without regular employment or income. Vagrants usually live in poverty, support themselves by begging, garbage scraping, petty theft, temporary work, or welfare. That's an image of vagrancy from the year 1536. That would be enclosures 500 years ago began. Vagrants. During that period, you see that on the left, the rainbows, double rainbow over the nicely ordered village. And then you see the woman with her daughter alone by the roadside with that little accordion. I think that indicates it's a vagrant. She has no village, no land. She's wandering. She's begging and singing a little song there to support herself and her daughter. And there you have a recent photo of a vagrant today, a homeless woman with her bags beside her with her begging sign. Now, a few years ago, I did what we called an Earth Rights Democracy tour in Australia. And Carl Fitzgerald directs Prosper Australia, one of our colleagues in the IU, took me to a building, like a warehouse building where indentured servants, I mean, these were indentured servants or people in the paupers prisons in England who were then shipped to the new lands. So of course, Australia was a penal colony settled by people from those prisons, those debtors' prisons. So he took me to a building still standing from 100 or so years ago. And there was the name and the story of a woman who had stolen a loaf of bread for her starving family and been caught, put in prison, and shipped to Australia. So it made it very real to me, very visceral, just what this enclosures meant and what these indentured servants and these paupers out of prisons and how they were used in the new lands to work on the lands that were claimed by a few of nobilities from England, nobles from England. Squatting and standing, the poor invaded public land as trespassers. They became the predominant class of America's antebellum period. Davy Crockett, not the legend, the real Davy Crockett. I mean, I was a kid, I wore this little coonscone cat and everybody sang, Davy, Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. Those of you from other countries may not have been familiar with Davy Crockett, but he was quite a legend. But he was an advocate of squatters' rights. He claimed that one of his powers was to squat down lower than any other man. He is referring to his own squatter past. The idea of being a squatter has significant legal meaning. In British law, squatting was the opposite of standing. To have legal standing was part of the legal principle that justified claims to sovereignty and justified the right to the land. The word itself comes from the root to stand erect. Now, the Maoris in New Zealand have a term, Taronga Wewe, and that is a term that means a right to stand, a place to stand. It's a land rights principle, Taronga Wewe. And the very first Green Party was really the New Zealand Values Party. This is back in 1970s, I believe. And the New Zealand Values Party pointed to the Maori Taronga Wewe principle of a place to stand as an indicator of the principle of the policy for land value taxation. So land value tax was very strong in the original Green Party of New Zealand, the land values, okay, so the main attributes of crackers and squatters was their movement in the verb of squatulate, which meant to mosey or to abscond, either on the slow road to nowhere or on the run. Squatters were the majority of Kentucky in the 1790s and remained 35 to 40% of the population in Tennessee, Alabama, and elsewhere as late as the 1850s. They are prevalent everywhere. Landless people wandering around, that high a percentage throughout the United States. The whole safety valve theory did not really work. In the old South, the number of landless poor whites grew at astounding rates. By the 1840s, there's a dramatic shift away from talking about squatters to what is now known as white trash, identified as a Southern phenomena, condemned for their sickly and abnormal children, clay eaters, because they were literally eating clay if they couldn't find food, viewed as clinical specimens belonging to an inferior breed, convicts and indentured servants of Jamestown, rubbish from the back alleys of London. Racism is not natural to Black-white difference, but created as a mechanism of control. Now, this photo relates to the burning of Jamestown, one of our earliest settlements, of course, 1676. In early America, slaves ran off to, we started having slaves come right away, didn't we? In early America, slaves ran off to Indian villages where they intermarried. During Bacon's rebellion, that was this Jamestown burning, Black slaves and white servants joined forces. The alliance between European indentured servants and Africans, many enslaved until death or sometimes freed, united by their bond servitude, disturbed the ruling class. The ruling class responded by hardening the racial caste of slavery in an attempt to divide the two races from subsequent united uprising with the passage of the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705. One of the laws passed said that only white people were allowed to have weapons. So that was a way to further divide and prevent this kind of conflict. You gave the poor whites, they could have guns, but the slaves were not allowed. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson, in an early version of the Declaration of Independence, drafted a 168-word passage that condemned slavery as one of the many evils foisted upon the colonies by the British Crown. The passage was cut from the final wording. Now, I'm from Pennsylvania. We were settled by William Penn, who became a Quaker and an outcast, thus from his family. His father was a wealthy, very wealthy admiral. And as an admiral, he was highly involved in the slave trade and made a lot of money, so much so that the King of England actually borrowed money from William Penn's father. Well, after quite some years of alienation from his father because he became a Quaker and was persecuted for that, when his father died, he inherited the debt owed by the king to his family. And thusly, we had the king give, in lieu of paying the debt with cash, he gave him land in the United States, which became Penn's Woods, Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania, consequently, under William Penn, had very, very respectful and good relationship with the Native Americans. Penn and other Quakers went to what was regions of what's now Germany, to the persecutions of people there that were believing that you should baptize later in life and not baptism at birth. So these Anabaptists were being persecuted. And so their lands were often taken away.
Right here, why?
They were excommunicated from the church. So the
Well,
Quakers.
I'm listening to Alanna.
Okay, Ed.
Well,
Maybe you
she's
could
giving a
mute.
lecture and I'm listening to it.
Okay, so these Anabaptists were invited to come to Pennsylvania.
About money?
Hey, Ed, can you please?
I haven't decided anything about money.
One of these things that happen when you're still trying to. I lost.
Yeah, now that you remember when you
so
said
the Anabaptists
$70,000 a year.
Maybe I can mute Ed. Settled in Pennsylvania, and I can drive a few miles north and I can see the Amish people in the horse and buggies. Almost every time I drive 10 miles north, there's the Amish settlements. And every time I might go out in the community, there are Mennonite people dressed in their Mennonite distinctive garb, So also Pennsylvania has more small towns than any other state in the United States because people here who settled Pennsylvania did not trust big centralized government. So that's the background to how the slave trade was very active already at the founding of the United States. And this is what Thomas Jefferson is talking about in this slide, how the evils of slavery was foisted upon the colonies by the British Crown. In his initial draft, Jefferson blamed Britain's King George for his role in creating and perpetrating the transatlantic slave trade, which he describes in so many words as a crime against humanity. He has waged, this is Jefferson's words, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. What is it? 10 to 20% of those on those slave ships died in the ships. And we've all maybe seen movies or pictures of those ships, layer upon layer of people laying on their backs for all those months. Just a horrible, horrible conditions. Some years ago, was in Senegal, and that's the most western tip of Africa. And there's an island, Gore. We took a little boat out to Gore, and there is a still standing house where the slaves were the African people being captured from inland, often by coastal Africans who went inland and captured people from other tribes and brought them to these buildings to await the ships, and then walked on a plank into the slave ship. I also went to a similar place in Nigeria. And so again, like, it's very visceral to actually be in the buildings and see the sights of where the people embarked on the slave ships from the continent of Africa. Not that long ago, folks. We know, not that long ago. Jefferson went on to call the institution of slavery piratical warfare, execrable commerce, and an assemblage of horrors. He then criticized the crown for exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. This passage refers to a 1775 proclamation by Britain's Lord Dunmore, which offered freedom to any enslaved person in the American colonies who volunteered to serve in the British Army against the Patriots' revolt. The proclamation inspired thousands of enslaved people to seek liberty behind British lines during the Revolutionary War. Okay? So you're a slave, you can get your freedom if you fight against those who are fighting for breaking away from Britain. So now we're into the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, 1865 to 1877. Although Congress responded with legislation that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, slaves kept on the books, states kept on the books laws that continued the legacy of the Black codes and therefore second-class citizenship of the newly freed slaves. In 1866, the Civil Rights Act, vetoed by President Johnson, now he came after Lincoln, but when it was passed by Congress, it outlined a number of civil liberties, including the right to make contracts, own and sell property, and receive equal treatment under the law. Congress passed the 14th Amendment in 1867. The amendment was designed to provide citizenship and civil liberties to the recently freed slaves. Following Lincoln's assassination in April of 1865, Andrew Johnson became president and inaugurated the period of presidential Reconstruction. Johnson offered a pardon to all Southern whites except Confederate leaders and wealthy planters, although most of these subsequently received individual pardons, restoring their political rights and all property except slaves. President Andrew Johnson also outlined how new state governments would be created. Apart from requirement that they abolish slavery, repudiate secession, and abrogate Confederate debt, these governments were granted a free hand in managing their affairs. These were the new states, okay? The new states, as the United States kept growing and pushing back Indian people. Still during that time, the Indian Wars, speculating and claiming more land. The new states came in, and he said they had basically a free hand to manage their affairs. And they responded by enacting the Black Codes, many of them, laws that required African Americans to sign yearly labor contracts, and in other ways sought to limit the freedoms, economic options, the freedmen's economic options, and reestablish plantation discipline. 14th Amendment put the principle of birthright citizenship into the Constitution and forbade states to deprive any citizen of the equal protection of the laws. Arguably the most important addition to the Constitution, other than the Bill of Rights, the amendment constituted a profound change in federal-state relations. Traditionally, citizens' rights have been delineated and protected by the states. Thereafter, the federal government would guarantee all Americans equality before the law against state violation. The 15th Amendment prohibited states from restricting the right to vote because of race. Something really profound happened at this time. 16 African Americans served in Congress in Reconstruction, including Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce in the US Senate. More than 600 in state legislatures and hundreds more in local offices, from sheriff to justice of the peace, scattered throughout and across the South. Reconstruction and the land question. Reconstruction made possible the consolidation of Black families, so often divided by sale during slavery, and the establishment of the independent Black church as the core institution of the emerging Black community. But the failure to respond to the former slaves' desire for land left most with no choice but to work for their former owners. Thaddeus Stevens, 40 acres and a mule. He's associated with this idea of land reform for the South. He championed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But here's some background that most of us would be unaware of. I know I was until recently. Special Field Orders, number 15, a post-Civil War promise proclaimed by Union General William Tecumseh Sherman on January 16, 1865, to allot family units, including freed people, a plot of land no larger than 40 acres, 16 hectares. Sherman later ordered the Army to lend mules for the agrarian reform effort. The field orders followed a series of conversations between Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton and radical Republican abolitionist Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, following disruptions to the institution of slavery provoked by the Civil War. Now, we may recall that the Republicans were anti-slavery and the Democrats were pro-slavery at the time. So The Truth Behind 40 Acres and a Mule by Henry Louis Gates Jr. But what many accounts leave out is that this idea for massive land distribution actually was the result of a discussion that Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton 4 days before Sherman issued the order. A discussion with 20 leaders of the Black community in Savannah, Georgia, where Sherman was headquartered following his march to the sea. The meeting was unprecedented in American history. Stanton had suggested to Sherman that they gather the leaders of the local Negro community and ask them something no one else had apparently thought to ask. What do you want for your own people following the war? And what they wanted astonishes us even today. What did they tell Sherman and Stanton that the Negro most wanted? Land. That way we can best take care of ourselves. Reverend Fraser began his answer to the crucial third question, is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor. And we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. And when asked next where the freed slaves would rather live, whether scattered among the whites or in colonies by themselves, without missing a beat, Brother Fraser, as the transcript calls him, replied, I would prefer to live by ourselves, for there is a prejudice against us in the South that will take years to get over. 4 days later, Sherman issued Special Field Order number 15 after President Lincoln approved it. So here's the order. Section 1, the islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers, abandoned, well, plantations, okay, abandoned plantations. We're right after the Civil War here. The abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea and the country bordering the St. Johns River, Florida, are reserved and set apart for the settlement of the Negroes now made free by the acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States. That is a very large land base. Fortunately, I don't have a map to show you, but it's 30 miles back from the ocean, and it's a long strip from the Carolinas down into Florida. I guess I have to mention that today there's large corporate agribusiness farms there that produce confined animal feeding operation pigs kept in terrible confinement, and there's just horrific land and air pollution. And the African Americans who live in that region are just sickened and poisoned by this terrible environments from the CAFOs. So I'm got a little bit ahead of this here, but so here's the proclamation. This was the 40 acres and the mule thoroughly being enacted. Section 2 specifies that these new communities, moreover, would be governed entirely by Black people themselves. On the islands and in the settlements hereafter to be established, no white person, whatever, unless military officers and soldiers detailed for duty will be permitted to reside, and the sole and exclusive management of affairs will be left to the free people themselves. By the laws of war and orders of the President of the United States, the Negro is free and must be dealt with as such. And finally, Section 3 specifies the allocation of land. Each family shall have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground, and when it borders on some water channel with not more than 800 feet waterfront, in the possession of which land the military authorities will afford them protection until such time as they can protect themselves, or until Congress shall regulate their title. What became of the land that was promised? By June, 40,000 freedmen had been settled on 400,000 acres of Sherman land. By the way, Sherman later ordered that the Army could lend the new settlers mules, hence the phrase 40 acres and a mule. And what happened to this astonishingly visionary program, which would have fundamentally altered the course of American race relations? Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor and a sympathizer with the South, overturned the order in the fall of 1865. And as Barton Myers sadly concludes, returned the land along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coasts to the planters who had originally owned it, to the very people who had declared war on the United States of America. By the turn of the century, a new racial system had been put in place in the South, resting on the disenfranchisement of Black voters, a rigid system of racial segregation, the relegation of African Americans to low-wage agricultural and domestic employment, and legal and extra-legal violence to punish those who challenged the new order. Nonetheless, while flagrantly violated, the Reconstruction Amendments remained in the Constitution, sleeping giants, as Charles Sumner called them, to be awakened by subsequent generations who fought to redeem the promise of genuine freedom for the descendants of slavery. Not until the 1960s and until in the civil rights movement, sometimes called the Second Reconstruction, would the country again attempt to fulfill the political and social agenda of Reconstruction. Notice, I think, that it does not say political, social, and economic agenda, because we did not hear about land rights in the 1960s. Okay, because prices on cotton and other crops remained low, sharecroppers and tenant farmers often fell into a cycle of indebtedness called debt peonage. Farmers found that the money they made selling the crops at the end of the growing season was not enough to pay back the loans they'd taken out for seed, tools, farm equipment, and living expenses, leaving them owing more after a year of labor than when they had started. This system, I mean, basically you had the plantation system restored, and then you had these small farms on less maybe desirable land, but a bit of the small farms happening. This system left both Black and white tenant farmers. Okay, they were actually renting their land in many cases, living in dire poverty. In addition, since no one had any money to spend, the Southern economy stagnated. This picture shows sharecroppers in Georgia around the year 1910, with both white and Black farm laborers. They worked in the sharecropping system, and that was where they had to, about half of the value of the crops they produced had to go to the landlord and to various debts that were owed. Okay, in 1960, civil rights movement, sometimes called Second Reconstruction. Where do we go from here? In Martin Luther King's speech, 1967, this address was made to the 10th anniversary convention of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Atlanta. Dr. King projected in it the issues which led to the Poor People's March on Washington. New forms of work will have to be devised, for whom traditional jobs are not available. In the 1879, Henry George anticipated this state of affairs when he wrote, okay, this is King talking about Henry George's idea. The fact is that the work which improves the condition of mankind, the work which extends knowledge and increases power and enriches literature and elevates thought, is not done to secure a living. It is not the work of slaves driven to their task, either by the taskmaster, or by animal necessity. It is the work of men who somehow find a form of work that brings a security for its own sake, any state of society where want is abolished. And then we have Thomas Paine earlier on in his Agrarian Justice. Men did not make the earth. It's the value of the improvements only, and not the earth itself that is individual property. Every proprietor owes to the community a ground rent for the land which he holds. From this ground rent, he says, I propose to create a national fund out of which will be paid to every person a sum. Got to say here a little bit, Thomas Paine was the early founding of the United States. Henry George was the latter part of the 1800s. Paine was familiar with the French physiocrats, economists, and advisors to the French kings, and he was familiar with the physiocrats like Turgot, Quesnay, Mirabeau. And Quesnay was considered the Confucius of Europe because there was so much interest in Chinese and Asian thought at the time. and what the documents show is that the idea the physiocrats had of the land rent belonging to the people, the unearned income, or what we call the ground rent, what Thomas Paine calls, was derived from land rights social arrangements in Asia early on. So it was not really original, as some of us would have thought, to the physiocrats as they looked at the land problem in France. But this very mechanism, this policy of collecting for the community the ground rent, has a really ancient history. And in fact, you can view history through a land lens from a fair society to great wealth inequality when you look at the land rights or lack thereof. And you will often find the land value tax or ground rent policy in the times of harmony and equality of society. So Thomas Paine died in poverty. He was not a land speculator. He did not acquire vast lands. He was a highly moral and ethical person. And subsequently, he died in poverty, I guess. But he saw this idea that he got from the physiocrats, and then he brought from England to the United States, and he was writing about it here. So this is what the king was perhaps beginning to grasp as he was beginning to look at the teachings of Henry George, and George rediscovered in his own search for why is there wealth inequality in the United States. He independently, through his own thought and questioning process, came upon the land problem and the solution. And then he saw that this was an ancient wisdom teaching. He had simply rediscovered. So had King continued to live, perhaps we hope he might have continued to look into Henry George. But so in this speech, he says, work of this sort, this valuable sort of work, could be enormously increased. We would call this right livelihood. We are likely to find that the problems of housing and education, instead of preceding the elimination of poverty, will themselves be effective if poverty is first abolished. The poor transformed into purchasers will do a great deal on their own to alter housing decay. Negroes who have a double disability will have a greater effect on discrimination when they have the additional weapon of cash to use in their struggle. Beyond these advantages, a host of positive psychological changes inevitably will result from widespread economic security. The dignity of the individual will flourish when the decisions concerning his life are in his own hands, when he has the means to seek self-improvement. Personal conflicts among husbands, wives, and children will diminish when the unjust measurement of human worth on the scale of dollars is eliminated. I want to say to you as I move to conclusion about the question, where do we go from here, that we honestly face the fact, excuse me, that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. And when you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalist economy. We've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. You see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? I'm not talking about communism. What I'm saying to you this morning is that communism forgets that life is individual. Capitalism forgets that life is social, and the kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis. It is found in a higher synthesis that combines the truths of both. Now, when I say question the whole society, it means ultimately come to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. Martin Luther King saw that we must go back to the future, to the perennial wisdom teachings. He said, an intelligent approach to the problems of poverty and racism will cause us to see that the words of the psalmist, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, are still a judgment upon our use and abuse of the wealth and resources with which we have been endowed. Now, a Seneca, that's a Native American tribe, a Seneca Nation elder, thinker and activist. He was also a university professor at University, State of New York at Buffalo. John Mohawk, Satsi Sowa, challenged readers to reset and then reboot their value systems, just like King was saying. So here in Thinking in Indian, a John Mohawk reader. John Mohawk, in his essay, The Problem of the Modern World, when land became a commodity and lost its status as provider and sustainer of life, Western civilization began its history of subjugation and exploitation of the earth and earth-based cultures. For nearly 5 centuries, people have been coerced from their land holdings. The problem in the English-speaking world has its roots in the 16th century. Okay, 500 years ago, he's talking about enclosures of the land, the root of our massive problems of wealth inequality. So we've gone through this deep history of the United States, 500 plus years, and we're going up to today, looking at Martin Luther King's, John Mohawk's teachings. Here's a Native American chief pointing out the crack in the Liberty Bell. So we did not have the technology to form a large metal bell that would not crack, and we did not have the foresight or the wisdom to form a political democracy that included economic democracy based on our democratic equal rights to the land and resources of the earth. Well, we can think of this as the chief pointing out that crack in the Liberty Bell. And John Locke and the crack in the Liberty Bell. To fully understand the severe limitations on our current form of democracy, it's necessary to trace the thread back to its fundamental tenets. John Locke's second treatise on civil government, the political Bible of the founding fathers, held that the great and chief end of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. Well, whose property? After enclosures, a lot of people had no property. So Locke said that people in England who wanted land could go to America to stake a claim from the vacant commons, the terra nullius of Roman law. This was justification for the Europeans to take land from the native people. Land, terra nullius, vacant land, because the native people were not considered to be human beings. They were like wild creatures of some sort in that view. The papal edicts said terra nulla, under Roman law, Europeans could come and stake out a claim in the Americas. The second proviso, the reasoning of the primary mentor of the founding fathers was faulty and limited. His justification for land enclosures and privatization, Locke failed to grasp the consequences for democracy of a time like ours, when so few humans would come to control so much of the earth. Nor could he have known how the forces of an industrial economy would drive land values to such heights, to the benefit of landowners and bank lenders rather than wage earners. The property and land problem is the crack in the Liberty Bell. It is the root dilemma of democracy. Having life and liberty without land rights breeds unhappiness, unemployment, wage slavery, anxiety, stress, ill health, and a multitude of other suffering. Militarization, murder, suicide, and premature death. And bold enough here to quote a few paragraphs from my E.F. Schumacher lecture, Democracy, Earth Rights, and the Next Economy. Land is not property. Land is life. Land is not created by people. It creates people. And here's our last passages of our International Declaration on Individual and Common Rights to Earth, which is the founding document of the International Union for Land Value Taxation. We hereby declare that the earth is the common heritage of all and that all people have natural and equal rights to the land of the planet. By the term land is meant all natural resources. Subject always to these natural and equal rights in land and to this common ownership, individuals can and should enjoy certain subsidiary rights in land. These rights properly enjoyed by individuals are the right to secure exclusive occupation of land, the right to exclusive use of land occupied, the right to the free transfer of land according to the laws of the country, and the right to transmit land by inheritance. But these individual rights do not include the right to use land in a manner contrary to the common good of all, in such a manner as to destroy or impair the common heritage. It does not include the individual right to appropriate what economists call the economic rent of land, or we call it the ground rent. The economic rent is the annual value attaching to the land alone, apart from any improvements thereon created by labor. This value is created by the existence of and the functioning of the whole community, wherein the individual lives and is in justice the property of the community. To allow this value to be appropriated by individuals enables land to be used not only for the production of wealth, but as an instrument of oppression of human by human, leading to severe social consequences, which are everywhere evident. This was produced about 80 years ago, a statement by an International Union for Land Value Taxation, an international conference. All humans have the right to land. These rights to land may be exercised in two ways: by holding land as individuals and or sharing in the common use of the economic rent of land. The economic rent of land can be collected for the use of the community by methods similar to those by which real estate taxes are now collected. That is what is meant by the policy of land value taxation. Were this community created land value collected, the many taxes which impede the production of wealth and limit purchasing capacity could be abolished. The exercise of both common and individual rights in land is essential to a society based on justice. But the rights of individuals in natural resources are limited by the just rights of the community. Denying the existence of common rights in land creates a condition of society wherein the exercise of individual rights becomes impossible for the great mass of the people. We therefore declare that the earth is the birthright of all people. 1949, this document's from founding document of the International Union for Land Value Taxation, I think puts it all together very well. So amendment for municipal charters, state and national constitutions. This would be to create an earth rights democracy. The Earth Rights Amendment. People have a right to the earth sustained in a healthy condition. Government shall enforce the liability of persons, corporate or real, who damage the carrying capacity of earth. People have a common heritage right to resource rents, the economic value of land sites and natural resources used to meet human needs. Their agent government is obliged to effect this sharing by collecting resource rents via taxes, leases, use fees, dues, or other means, and then dispersing the recovered rents as dividends or via services that benefit all members of society equally. Our basis of our present land claims is a complex historical weave of territorial claims by discovery, purchase, constitutional law, length of residency, military might, and other ways to gain and maintain secure possession. But ultimately, the only rational, supportable, moral, just, and ethical basis to assert claim to the earth's land and resources is by birthright to the gifts of nature. And this cannot be an exclusive claim. The claim by birthright can only be legitimate if it is acknowledged that all other human beings have an equal claim. The deepest ethical dimension of territorial rights recognizes that humanity is one and indivisible in its fundamental claim to the earth as a birthright of all. The cure for economic and war crimes against humanity is to awaken to the realization that though we are many, we are in truth one humanity. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Oh, say, can you see our common humanity, sprung from the earth, our mother, and seeded from the sun? We are in truth children of the universe, and no less than the trees and the stars. You and I have the equal right to be here now and to claim this planet and its natural and its land and natural resources as our full, fair, and natural birthright. I pledge allegiance to the earth and all the life which it supports. One planet in our care, irreplaceable, with sustenance and respect for all. Janina, Lamb Lion Studio Art. The earth is the birthright of all people. Okay, folks. Went over a little bit over an hour. I hope many of you are still with us. You can open your mics if you have thing to do chat. I've got to take this down, but so we're open now to comments and questions from those of you who've heard this presentation. And we want to thank our co-sponsors also, Council of Georgia's Organization, Earth Rights Institute, Public Revenue Education Council, Better Cities Committee, School of Cooperative Individualism, CONFED, and the Lay Society. Okay. Okay, I see there are some in chat. Hi guys, my internet is down. Please post the slides. From Periac to me. Okay, he had to leave. We'll catch the end when it's posted. All the best. All right. I can see everybody now. We can see each other. You just want to raise your hand and then just start talking for comments and questions. I see, who is that? Mike. Hi, Mike.
I just want to say that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. I learned something today. I've always had a problem with the fact that the Secretary of War, Stanton, may very well have been involved with John Wilkes Booth. You know, there's this conspiracy theory there. But anyway, when I learned that he was involved with the 40 acres and the mule, I felt a little better because my grandfather was named after him.
Oh, great. That's good news for you then.
So you've redeemed my family.
Yay! Redemption.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, other questions and comments?
I have a question.
Kai Hayner in Germany.
Alanna, the talk was wonderful. Mike, I just wanted to say, you remember me, Mike?
I sure do. Thank you.
That's good. And I wanted to say, yeah, it's good to put it on the website, and we'll continue in this vein. I think it was terrific. It was a wonderful talk.
Happy to hear. Welcome. Ed in New Jersey. You got to unmute yourself, my friend. Ed is the director of the
School of Cooperative Individualism.
One of our co-sponsors.
I know it's a mouthful, but anyway, no, I really I apologize for getting in late, but I listened to your talk, and I get the sense that you and I agree that the history of the United States is a history of continuous violence. And I don't think that people really understand just how violent a society we live in here. And the history of that violence goes back to the very beginning. But there are a lot of dangers, in my view, with romanticizing the relations of the tribal people who were here before Europeans arrived. And that's one of my concerns about how history is taught, and what we as people who embrace Henry George's sort of his own theory of history need to emphasize and remind people that that it just, I guess the way I mean it to say is, your story, the way we've delivered the history, clearly conveys that history is messy, and that people have conflicting objectives, even when they have a desire for moral outcomes. And so I agree that this story needs to be told. I don't know how we reach the number of people that need to hear it, and then the number of people who hear it are willing to actually listen to the facts, because that's really where we are in the world today. It seems that too many people just do not want to be influenced by the facts. But anyway, I think you did a great job.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Next comments, questions, Michael Leroy.
Can I say a few words?
Yes, Michael, where are you? What country are you in?
I'm in London.
Okay,
London.
very good.
And I couldn't get in for the first half hour because I was at another Zoom meeting. We seem to be living in Zoom at the moment in various ways. But so in any way of catching up on the initial history, which I found a bit surprising and a bit anti-English, perhaps. Anyway.
Depends on which class of English you represent.
Well, who knows? I mean, I might be criticised in various ways on that, but I'm interested in the facts and the truth of these things, and that history sounded very interesting. So any way of getting the rest of that would be, I would
yes,
find very...
Michael, hopefully our recording goes smoothly and we're able to then post it on our YouTube.
Okay.
So on our IU now has a good, hopefully last week's is now nicely posted there. People have been viewing it. So hopefully this too, Michael. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll look forward to that, because it needs careful study and attention to actually look at it and unravel it, really. But I thought the broad basis, and I found it very authoritative and very efficiently given, and I enjoyed it immensely. But the nitty-gritty comes later, obviously, and to see where we go from here, really, because it's all about the present. The past is full of bad thoughts and bad actions, but we can only really affect the actions from now on, really. So it's how we act today.
Right. Well, really Michael, important. We have and we do have good news, and we hope to have a presentation, a forum in January. And you've got, in my screen at least, Kai Hainer is directly above you. Kai's from Germany, and Germany has just succeeded in its second largest province, deciding to have land value tax. And I think this is year 2024, Kai. So this is really big current progress and success for us. We're going to be hearing more about Mike. Okay, who else wants to talk and give some input here?
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
I think it's quite important to understand, really look at the concept of economic rent, because I think it's got a lot of inaccuracies in it, and a lot of misunderstandings. So we need to readdress and re-evaluate what we really mean by economic rent, what in fact it really is, because I think there's a lot of confusion and a lot of corruption in it. Really, it's become very very distorted in so many ways.
Thanks, Michael. We'll keep that in mind for a future IU forum. It's important. Who wants to give some input next?
Well, perhaps I could just follow it up, Alanna. I'm also from London and a friend and colleague of Michael. And he and I have been in the previous Zoom meeting. Yes, I was interested in the British influence, which you referred to, on the American colony, and the specific quotation now of Jefferson on George III, which is quite startling. Of course, there is an individual who is well known in America, namely Edmund Burke, who was supportive of the American independence movement, recognizing that it was appropriate at the time for America to separate itself because it wasn't properly represented through the parliamentary process. I think there is perhaps as much awareness of Edmund Burke in America as there is here. I'm not sure about that, but certainly he's a great British statesman, born in Ireland, of course, who understood far more deeply and widely than most people on all the great issues of his day, including India and, of course, France. But I was interested in the point that Michael referring to about the, as it were, the transfer of slavery and deprivation of land ownership from Britain to America, if that is the gist of the story you were telling at that time.
Yes, it is. Thank you. Thank you, James.
Alanna, it's worth mentioning that only Thomas Paine was the one member of the founding generation that came out against slavery. And I've often wondered how he developed a positive relationship with Jefferson when, Paine did make such an insightful statement when he first arrived in North America, saying that here are the subjects of British authority are rebelling against the empire and against their own slavery when they themselves are enslaving other people. So I think on both sides of the Atlantic, we share Paine as a moral hero, and I'm sort of gratified to hear that there's more recognition in the UK of Paine's contributions, and I'm hoping that here in the United States that will be something as well, because I describe Paine as the originator of the philosophy of cooperative individualism, and that the torch that he carried fell to the ground and nearly went out until Henry George arrived to lift it back up and get it shining brightly. And so I think Paine is someone that we in the Georgist movement or community really need to champion more, because he's more, his name, his ideals are more highly recognized than those of Henry George today.
Ed, you may have come in a little late, but I did include statements from Jefferson that he wrote for the Declaration of Independence that were very strongly against slavery, very strong, but they were taken out. They did not, he was under a lot of pressure from slave owners.
Yeah,
So,
and I understand. I mean, Jefferson's role is complicated. It is true that the laws of Virginia at the time prevented the actual manumission of slaves. So he would have been violating the law, but he continued to own individuals as slaves throughout his entire life. And there's another piece of history that probably not very many people know about, and that is it is now documented that Thomas Paine contributed to the language written in the Declaration of Independence. A draft with his notations on it has been found. And so he was clearly, his ideas were taken into consideration by Franklin and Jefferson as they were drafting the Declaration.
Okay, I see. Thank you very much, Ed. I see a little note that popped up from Scott. But Scott, before I could read it, can you just unmute yourself and mention that? Would you mind?
Which one? I've been posting a lot.
Oh, I can't keep up with everything that the chat, but just please, you've got much to say, I'm sure. So go ahead.
So, I mean, Jefferson basically hadn't done the economics, which is kind of surprising because he was such a scientifically minded person. But if he had, he would have discovered what actually a former slave owner told Henry George, who George quoted in one of his books, that basically after slavery, the economics favored the former slave owner because all he had to pay was a small pittance for labor, and he didn't have to supply land and housing and upkeep for his former slaves. And they would, of course, supply their own housing somewhere, which was no longer the slave owner's problem. And they would just pay, the slave owner would just pay a small salary. So in reality, the economics was not any better for slavery for the former slaves. Of course, they had freedom, but freedom from want, not so much.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Was Charlie going to talk next? And then maybe Mike.
Yes, I think there are two of your founding fathers who were born on the same day and died on the same day and debated like heck all their public life. And I think their idealism was equal to each other, but their class position was different. So while you had Thomas Jefferson in the South, remember you had John Adams in the North. Yeah. And so many books have now been written on the Adams, John and John Quincy. And John Quincy was the one who predicted in full detail after his presidency and when he was in the Congress too, and in arguing before the courts about the forthcoming civil war, which he thought was inevitable because of the ownership question, not just the ownership of lands, but of the people on the land, and that it had to be put in the right perspective. These were great philosophers, and they have not been studied sufficiently. Thomas Paine is a great philosopher, and I am so happy that he is mentioned here. Of course, George Washington was one of the biggest landowners in world history, barring none. So I don't think he would have minded even not being president in the first place. But the competition between Adams and Jefferson, which was for real, not just in ideas, but in living out what they meant. Something for the Georges to really look into. But congratulations, Alanna, for such a great presentation and all the study you put into it. I'm happy to note that there were 3 other Filipinos who were here earlier. One, I think, went to sleep already. Elid Wodihar.
It's very late there, isn't it? About 1 a.m.
Mayet is in the Confederation also. And Daisy, Leonis, both of them are also in the Lay Society of St. Arnold Johnson. Welcome, both of you, to this.
Is that Mayette and Daisy?
Daisy, Daisy, yeah.
And Mayette.
Yes. Are you still awake?
Oh, they are still, there they are. Thank you for staying up so late, 1 o'clock in the morning in the Philippines.
No, it's 12. Yeah,
Oh, 12.
12:45. 12:45.
Okay, almost. All right. Well, thank you both.
Almost 1.
That's great. Now, Charles is our vice president on our IU executive, vice president for the Philippines, and he'll be giving our IU forum next week, next Saturday, on the land problem in the Philippines, on both external and internal challenges and realities around that. And we look forward to hearing you next week, Charlie. Thank you. Okay. And we're
Yes.
thinking we'll have other forums in the future at times more convenient for Asia. We're going to start rotating times a bit, but you have another late night coming up.
Yes. Thank
Can
you.
I make one other comment, please, Alanna?
Okay. I saw Mike Curtis next, and then I'll go to Michael Leroy.
Okay.
Just looking at who I saw hands.
One of the things you brought up was the physiocrats. And of course, a lot of people would say they're the real fathers of political economy. And a few years ago, I read that the physiocrats did not actually advocate a tax on the potential rent like Henry George, but on the actual income from land. Does anyone know which it was? Because they would be like night and day. In other words, if you have a piece of land that's idle and you have no income,
you wouldn't
from it,
pay anything.
There would be no rent, so
Yeah.
you'd pay no tax.
Yeah.
Whereas what George and we advocate is if you have the land, whatever it's worth, you
Yeah.
got to pay it, the rental value. So does anybody know if that was the case?
I think we need to do more research.
That's going to be investigated, yeah. That needs to be investigated.
Thanks, Mike.
Correct.
Okay, Michael Leroy, maybe you know the answer.
Well, in fact,
Yeah, it needs to be investigated.
yeah, we have a couple of meetings. I'm in the Henry George Foundation here in London, and we have 2 meetings on Fridays, and we're studying progress in poverty and the last one. What's it called?
Science of political economy.
Yeah, science of political economy. And in the science of political economy, there's a very long passage in concerning the physiocrats, which might be useful to refer to. And he quotes from someone, Henry Drummond MacLeod, who was an interesting person to look up what he said, because a lot of the material for the French physiocrats is in French, and it's not really available in English translations, and that's an omission that's sadly missed, really, because they really had something fundamental to what they were doing. And the other point was, in fact, in the annotated works, which are a wonderful thing that's happening really with it, I shall come back. In volume
The annotated works of Henry George is what you're referring to, right?
And yes, and in volume 1, there's we were particularly struck when we all read it through here, Our Land and Land Policy by Henry George, which was pre-Progress in Poverty. And he sets out in wonderful historical observation what was happening in America, etc. So these early works and this series in particular, I can only recommend because it brings us to address what Henry George actually wrote and what actually said, and reanalyze it, not to just adopt it as something that's got to be believed, but as a starting point for our own, bringing it into the 21st century, and understand how our observation of it has moved on a little bit. There's lots of things been added by worthy people over 100 years, etc. Whether we're going away or not, it is another matter. But it's readdressing and what he actually observed at white heat almost. That's all the point.
Sounds interesting what you're doing. Thank you. Okay, going once, going twice. No more comments. I'm going to turn it to Wendy. Get ready to unmute, Wendy, so you can. Okay, Ed has something.
Just one final observation.
Yes.
I have begun to use the term sharecropper to describe not only the people who lived on the land in the southern part of the United States and had to pay landowners much in rents, but the same situation for people who migrated to the northern cities to work in factories, were in many ways a sharecropper, sharing their income with the monopolist property owners that forced them to live in crowded tenements with no services, et cetera. So I think in many respects, even today, many people in the world continue to be sharecroppers, even if they don't share the rents with an agricultural landowner.
A good way to segue between an agricultural to an industrial wage economy, Ed, is a good way to put it.
And it seems to resonate with students. They get that when they
Get
teach
it.
it.
A good bridge phrase then, good term. Okay, everybody, thank you so very much. I'm gonna
Thank you.
thank you for being present. I'm gonna turn this over to Wendy and try to get to my last slide here somewhere. And the last slide, just if that's, we're sorting through all these.
Well, this is Wendy speaking. I want to thank everyone for participating, and this will be posted, so we can study it further, and we can, you know, it's exciting that there are people from so many different parts of the planet, and I think that we all have this same story to tell, and it would be nice to hear it. And I hope, you know, next week we're going to hear it from the Philippines, which is, I think, you know, we all inherit from our mothers and fathers, and it's really up to us to take our inheritance the best and try to understand the mistakes in the past and why, and to understand our relationship to our mother, so that we can heal and move forward in a positive way, where we can all share our mother, and understand that we will all be better, healthier, saner, if we can understand the security in sharing, as opposed to the fear of always having to have more and more, which is a very false security. Um, and I think, you know, another theme that I think is important, that I think Scott asked, was about war. Why do we have wars when everybody loses? What is it that we understand or think we understand, that war is something that will somehow benefit us? You know, how can we move forward? How can we, you know, there's so many examples, just the utter destruction and stupidity of it. And how can we move forward and develop another theory of life, that is one of again, sharing and of helping and of being part of a community, as opposed to trying to subjugate others for my benefit somehow. Anyway, I thank everyone, and I want to hear more of these stories, so that we can build a better future for our children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren, that they may have maybe a simpler, healthier life than we were led to believe, that accumulation was the road to happiness. And I think that's mistaken. So thank you. And I hope to see many of you next week.
Hey,
This is
goodbye
fun.
all. Take
Good
care.
night.
Thank you
Bye,
Yeah.
very
Michael.
much,
Bye.
Alanna, Wendy.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Alanna. It was
Bye.
wonderful.
Yes, thank you all. Best wishes.